Outside a quiet neighborhood in Colorado Springs, Colorado, police officers had sealed off a large residential property after what appeared to be a carefully planned burglary that had unexpectedly turned into a suspicious death investigation. Detectives moved from room to room collecting fingerprints, photographing evidence, and interviewing neighbors. Crime scene technicians documented every inch of the house, while investigators struggled to understand why so many small details seemed to contradict one another. After nearly 6 hours of work, the case still made no sense. Standing quietly behind the yellow police tape was an 80-year-old man wearing a faded brown overcoat, an old detective's fedora, and carrying a weathered leather notebook beneath one arm. A polished walnut cane supported his slow, deliberate steps. Everyone assumed he was simply an elderly neighbor waiting to give a statement. Unlike everyone else, however, he never looked directly at the body or the evidence markers. Instead, he quietly observed the windows, the furniture, the tire tracks near the driveway, the position of the curtains, and the expressions of the investigators themselves. A group of young detectives noticed him watching the house. One smiled. Poor gentleman probably saw something. Another laughed. Let's hope he remembers it. A third glanced at the old man carefully studying the front porch instead of the investigators. Careful, sir. Leave the detective work to us. The group laughed together. The elderly man simply smiled politely and remained silent. A few minutes later, the lead detective announced that the investigation would temporarily pause while the forensic laboratory processed the collected evidence. At that moment, the old man slowly approached the command vehicle. "Excuse me," he said calmly. "May I ask one question before everyone leaves?" One detective sighed politely. "Of course, sir. Were you nearby when this happened?" The old man gently shook his head. "No." "Then what would you like to ask?" He looked back toward the front entrance of the house. "Why are you treating this as a burglary?" Several detectives exchanged amused glances. One smiled, "Because that's exactly what all the evidence suggests." The old man nodded respectfully. "That's what worries me." Before anyone could respond, a black police SUV pulled into the street. The chief of police stepped out, looked toward the elderly visitor, and immediately stopped walking. Without hesitation, he crossed the police line, stood at attention, and rendered a respectful salute. "Captain Daniel Mercer," he said with unmistakable admiration. "I never thought I'd see you at another crime scene." Every conversation stopped. Only moments earlier, everyone had believed the quiet old man was simply another elderly witness. None of them realized they were standing beside one of the most respected homicide detectives in the history of the Colorado Springs Police Department, a man who had solved hundreds of major cases during 38 years of service, trained generations of investigators, and earned a legendary reputation for reconstructing crimes using observation long before laboratory reports arrived. Inside the worn leather notebook he carried rested decades of handwritten investigative notes, along with one sealed letter from the detective who had taught him that evidence never truly lies. But investigators sometimes ask it the wrong questions. Before the forensic laboratory returned a single result that evening, the entire department would discover why a crime scene begins speaking long before fingerprints are analyzed, learn the emotional story hidden inside the old detective's notebook, and witness an 80-year-old investigator solve the case simply by seeing what everyone else had overlooked. Yellow police tape stretched across the front yard of a quiet suburban home in Colorado Springs, Colorado, as detectives and forensic technicians worked methodically through what appeared to be a violent burglary that had ended in a suspicious death. Patrol officers kept curious neighbors behind the barricades, while photographers documented every room. Fingerprint specialists, dusted door handles, and evidence markers slowly filled the living room floor. After nearly 6 hours of investigation, the lead detective still couldn't explain why several details inside the house seemed to contradict one another. Near the edge of the police line stood an 80-year-old man wearing a faded brown overcoat, an old detective's fedora, and carrying a weathered leather notebook beneath one arm. A polished walnut cane supported each careful step as he quietly watched the scene. Unlike the crowd gathered behind the tape, he never stared toward the body being removed from the house. Instead, his eyes moved slowly across the front porch, the flower beds, the tire marks beside the driveway, the curtains in the upstairs windows, and the footprints crossing the wet grass. He seemed less interested in the crime itself than in everything surrounding it. A group of young detectives noticed him after finishing another round of interviews. One smiled. "Looks like our elderly witness is conducting his own investigation." Another laughed. Maybe he remembers seeing something from 20 years ago. A third detective grinned. Careful, sir. The crime scene is already crowded enough. The group laughed together. The old man simply smiled politely and continued watching the house without saying a word. A few minutes later, the lead detective gathered the investigation team near the command vehicle. We're waiting on fingerprints, DNA, and lab analysis, he announced. Until then, treat this as a burglary that escalated into homicide. As the officers began organizing their notes, the elderly man slowly approached the command vehicle. Excuse me, he said calmly. May I ask you something? The lead detective looked up politely. Of course, sir. Were you a witness? The old man shook his head. No. Then how can we help you? He looked quietly toward the front door of the house. Why are you calling this a burglary? Several detectives exchanged amused glances. One answered confidently. The back window was forced open. Jewelry is missing. Several drawers were emptied. That's a burglary. The old man nodded respectfully. Yes. He paused for a moment. But why would a burglar close every curtain before leaving? The detectives fell silent for a second before one shrugged. Maybe he didn't want anyone outside seeing him. The old man smiled gently. Perhaps. He looked back toward the upstairs windows. Then why leave every downstairs curtain open? Before anyone could answer, the sound of an approaching police SUV echoed through the quiet neighborhood. The vehicle stopped beside the command post, and Chief of Police Michael Reynolds stepped out. As he walked toward the investigators, his eyes fell upon the elderly man standing beside the police tape. He stopped immediately. Without hesitation, he crossed the scene, stood at attention, and rendered a respectful salute. Captain Daniel Mercer, he said warmly. I was hoping the rumors were true. Every conversation stopped. The detectives stared in complete disbelief. Daniel calmly returned the salute. Good afternoon, Chief. Reynolds smiled. You should have called. Daniel looked back toward the house. I heard one of your detectives had an interesting puzzle. One of the younger investigators looked at the chief in confusion. Sir, you know him? Reynolds smiled proudly. Know him? He looked around at the assembled officers. Captain Daniel Mercer spent 38 years in homicide. He pointed toward the quiet old detective. He solved more major murder cases than anyone in the history of this department. Complete silence settled across the scene. Reynolds continued. Half the investigative procedures you use today were written by him. The young detectives slowly looked back toward Daniel. Only moments earlier they had dismissed him as an elderly witness. Now they realized they were standing beside the detective, whose case files they had studied in the academy. Daniel quietly rested one hand on his worn leather notebook before speaking again. I hope I'm wrong. He looked toward the front porch one more time. Because 30 years ago, I stood in front of another house that looked almost exactly like this. The investigation team remained completely silent after Captain Daniel Mercer mentioned another house from 30 years earlier. The younger detectives looked from the quiet old investigator to Chief Michael Reynolds, sensing that everyone except them already understood what Daniel meant. Reynolds folded his arms and nodded slowly. The Hollow Creek case. Daniel smiled faintly. I hoped history wouldn't repeat itself. One of the lead detectives stepped forward. Captain, what happened? Daniel rested his weathered leather notebook on the hood of the command vehicle before answering. 30 years ago, we investigated what everyone believed was a burglary that had turned into a homicide. He looked toward the house across the street. Broken window. Missing valuables. Furniture pulled apart. Everything looked exactly like this. One detective quietly nodded. So what changed? Daniel closed his eyes for a moment as if seeing the old crime scene again. An elderly patrol officer asked me one question. The younger detectives waited silently. He asked, why is everything so organized? Several officers exchanged puzzled looks. Daniel continued. At first I thought he was joking. He smiled sadly. Then I walked back inside and looked again. He pointed toward the house behind the police tape. Real burglaries are chaotic. People searching for valuables don't stop to make things look convincing. He paused, but people trying to stage a burglary do. The detective slowly looked back toward the front door. Daniel continued. In the Hollow Creek case, the drawers had all been emptied. He smiled faintly, but every drawer had been pulled out almost the same distance. One detective frowned. I never would have noticed that. Daniel nodded. Because you were looking for fingerprints. He looked around the group. I was supposed to be looking for behavior. Complete silence settled over the command post. Daniel pointed toward the upstairs windows of the current house. Tell me something. How many curtains are closed? One detective answered. Only the upstairs front rooms. Exactly. Daniel nodded. Now tell me. He looked toward the living room windows. Why would someone trying to avoid being seen leave the entire first floor exposed to the street? No one answered. Daniel smiled gently. That's not evidence of a burglary. He looked directly at the lead detective. That's evidence of someone thinking about what a burglary should look like. The words hung in the air. Chief Reynolds quietly turned toward the crime scene supervisor. Have we confirmed exactly which valuables are missing? Not yet, Chief. Then do it immediately. Yes, sir. Daniel slowly walked toward the edge of the police tape and studied the front porch once more. His eyes settled on a muddy footprint beside the entrance. He never stepped across the tape. He simply watched it for several seconds before quietly asking, "Who found that footprint?" A forensic technician raised his hand. "I did." Daniel nodded politely. "Was there any mud anywhere else on the walkway?" The technician hesitated. "No." Daniel looked toward him kindly. "Interesting." One of the younger detectives frowned. "Why?" Daniel pointed toward the neatly swept concrete leading to the front door. "If someone walked here through wet grass." He smiled gently. "Why is there only one muddy footprint?" The detectives looked at one another without speaking. Daniel quietly opened his old leather notebook. Between its yellowed pages were dozens of handwritten observations collected over nearly 4 decades of homicide investigations. Tucked inside the final page rested a sealed envelope that had remained unopened for many years. Chief Reynolds noticed it immediately. "You're still carrying Lieutenant Walker's letter." Daniel rested one hand on the notebook. "Every day." Reynolds lowered his voice. "You promised him?" Daniel nodded once. "He told me never to open it until I met a generation of detectives who understood that solving a case begins long before the laboratory finishes its work." The neighborhood became silent once again, as every detective slowly realized they were no longer waiting for forensic evidence. They were learning how to see a crime scene the way a master investigator did. The command post grew unusually quiet as detectives began looking at the house differently. For the first time that day, they stopped searching only for fingerprints and DNA. They started asking why the scene looked the way it did. Captain Daniel Mercer remained outside the police tape, his eyes moving slowly across the front yard without taking a single step into the protected crime scene. "No one touch anything," he said calmly. "Just observe." The younger detectives followed his gaze. Daniel pointed toward the flower bed beneath the broken rear window. "Tell me what you see." One detective answered immediately. "Broken glass." Daniel smiled gently. "Look again." The detective leaned closer. "Most of the glass is outside the house." Daniel nodded. "Exactly." Complete silence settled over the group. "If someone broke the window from outside to get in," Daniel explained, "where should most of the glass be?" One of the forensic technicians quietly replied, "Inside?" Daniel smiled. "Correct." He looked back toward the window. "That tells us the window was most likely broken from inside after the incident." Several detectives exchanged stunned glances. The lead detective slowly lowered his notebook. "So, the point of entry was staged." Daniel nodded. "We're getting closer." He then pointed toward the front porch where the single muddy footprint remained protected by an evidence marker. "Now look at that footprint again." A young detective frowned. "Still, only one." "Exactly." Daniel looked around the group. No return footprint. No trail across the yard. No mud leading toward the street. He paused. "Someone placed that footprint there." The crime scene technician looked surprised. "You mean, intentionally?" Daniel nodded. "Almost certainly." Chief Reynolds quietly folded his arms. "Someone wanted us to believe an intruder came through the yard." Daniel smiled faintly. "And for several hours, it worked." He slowly turned toward the driveway. Parked beside the house sat the victim's vehicle. Daniel studied it for several seconds before asking another question. "Who moved the car?" "Nobody," the lead detective answered. "It hasn't been touched." Daniel nodded. "Good." He pointed toward the driver's side mirror. "Then why is it folded inward?" The detectives stared at the vehicle. One officer quietly whispered, "Automatic car wash?" Daniel gently shook his head. "The rest of the car is covered with fresh pollen." He looked toward the mirror again. "If it had gone through a car wash this morning, the pollen wouldn't still be there." Nobody answered. Daniel smiled softly. "Someone folded that mirror after the car was already parked." Chief Reynolds looked thoughtful. "Why would anyone do that?" Daniel replied without hesitation. "Because another vehicle needed just a little more room beside it." The lead detective's eyes widened. "You think someone familiar with the victim arrived before the crime scene was staged?" Daniel nodded. "Not a burglar." someone who belonged here. A heavy silence filled the neighborhood. Daniel slowly opened his worn leather notebook. He carefully turned through dozens of pages filled with handwritten observations from old homicide cases before stopping on one page dated 30 years earlier. At the top, written in neat blue ink, were 8 simple words. When evidence looks perfect, look for the person arranging it. One detective quietly read the sentence aloud. Daniel smiled. Lieutenant Samuel Walker wrote that after the Hollow Creek case, he gently touched the sealed envelope, still tucked inside the notebook. He told me the biggest mistakes detectives make aren't caused by missing evidence. Daniel looked back toward the quiet house. They're caused by believing the evidence was left there honestly. Just then, a forensic technician came running from inside the house carrying a property inventory sheet. "Detective," he called, "we found something strange." The lead detective took the document. "What is it?" The technician pointed toward the list. According to the victim's family, he paused, looking genuinely confused. None of the jewelry reported stolen was ever kept in the drawers that were emptied. Complete silence fell across the scene. Daniel quietly closed his notebook. "Now," he said, "we can finally stop investigating a burglary and start investigating a murder." The entire investigation changed within minutes. Patrol officers expanded the perimeter. Detectives stopped treating the house as the scene of a failed burglary, and the forensic team began re-examining every room with a completely different objective. Captain Daniel Mercer remained standing quietly outside the police tape, watching the investigators work with calm satisfaction. He had not touched a single piece of evidence, yet the entire direction of the case had changed because of a handful of simple observations. Chief Michael Reynolds walked over carrying Daniel's weathered leather notebook. "Daniel," he said softly, "I think Lieutenant Walker would want you to open it now." Daniel looked at the notebook for several long moments before slowly nodding. "I believe you're right." He carefully opened the back cover. Resting inside was a yellowed envelope that had remained sealed for nearly 30 years. Written across the front in faded black ink were only a few words. "For Daniel, open only after you find detectives who are ready to observe before they accuse." Every detective gathered around the command vehicle in complete silence. Daniel gently broke the seal and unfolded the letter. "Sam gave me this after the Hollow Creek investigation," he said quietly. "He told me I'd know when the right day came." He took a slow breath and began reading aloud. "If you're holding this letter, then another generation has finally discovered that a crime scene is not a collection of evidence. It is the final conversation between the truth and the person trying to hide it." No one moved. Daniel continued, "Never become so dependent on laboratories that you stop trusting your own eyes. Fingerprints tell you who touched something. DNA tells you who was present, but neither can explain why people made the choices they did. That is the detective's responsibility." Several younger investigators lowered their heads. Daniel read on. "The first story told by a crime scene is almost never the true one. It is the story someone wanted you to believe. Your job is not to prove that story. Your job is to discover the one hidden beneath it." Chief Reynolds quietly smiled. Daniel reached the final paragraph. "One day, you'll become the oldest detective at a crime scene. When that day comes, remember that your greatest achievement will not be solving another murder. It will be teaching younger detectives how to ask better questions than you ever did." Daniel slowly folded the letter and returned it to the notebook. Before anyone spoke, a forensic examiner hurried out of the house carrying a sealed evidence bag. "Chief," she called, "we found fresh paint flakes on the inside edge of the broken window frame." Reynolds looked toward Daniel immediately. Daniel nodded. "The window was broken after the victim died." The examiner continued, "And there's something else." She held up another evidence bag. The victim's house keys were found inside the kitchen trash. The lead detective frowned. "Why would the killer throw away the keys?" Daniel smiled gently. "Because the killer used them." Complete silence settled over the command post. Reynolds looked toward the investigation team, which means whoever staged this scene never forced the front door. Daniel nodded. They walked in exactly the way the victim expected them to. One of the younger detectives looked at Daniel with genuine admiration. "Captain, you solved all of this before the lab confirmed any of it." Daniel smiled kindly. "No." He looked back toward the quiet house. "The house solved it." He gently tapped the cover of his old notebook. "I simply listened carefully enough to hear what it had been trying to say all afternoon." The investigation was completed just before midnight. As the forensic reports continued arriving, every major conclusion confirmed what Captain Daniel Mercer had recognized hours earlier. Simply by observing the scene, The broken window had been shattered from inside the house after the victim was already dead. The muddy footprint near the porch had been deliberately planted. The missing jewelry had never been stored in the drawers that had been emptied. The victim's house keys contained fresh traces of the suspect's fingerprints, proving the front door, not the window, had been used to enter the home. By dawn, detectives had arrested a business associate of the victim who had staged the burglary to disguise a carefully planned murder motivated by financial fraud. The suspect had spent hours trying to create a crime scene that looked convincing. In the end, it was the tiny details he overlooked that revealed the truth. As the last patrol units prepared to leave, Chief Michael Reynolds walked beside Daniel Mercer to the front porch of the now quiet house. "You solved the case before the laboratory finished its work," he said. Daniel smiled gently. "No." He looked toward the evidence markers still scattered across the yard. The laboratory confirmed the truth. He rested one hand on his worn leather notebook. "Observation found it first." Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. "That's a lesson this department needs to remember." Daniel slowly opened the notebook one final time. Folded inside the back cover was a single page written in his own handwriting many years earlier. Across the top were 3 simple principles. Observe before you conclude. Ask why before you ask who. Every detail tells part of someone's story. The chief of police quietly read the words aloud. No one spoke for several moments. Reynolds then turned toward the detectives gathered around the command vehicle. "Beginning today," he announced, "every homicide detective entering this department will study these 3 principles before leading a major investigation." A quiet murmur of approval spread through the group. Reynolds smiled at Daniel once more. "There's one more thing I'd like you to see." Together they drove back to police headquarters, where an empty glass display case had been prepared inside the department's historical gallery. Reynolds carefully placed Daniel's weathered leather notebook, Lieutenant Samuel Walker's letter, the original case notes from the Hollow Creek investigation, and the first evidence sketch from today's murder case inside the display. At the center rested a bronze plaque engraved with the words, "The Walker-Mercer Investigative Legacy," dedicated to Lieutenant Samuel Walker and Captain Daniel Mercer, whose integrity, patience, and unwavering pursuit of truth continue guiding every detective who wears this badge. Great investigations begin not with evidence, but with observation. Daniel stood quietly before the display for several long moments before smiling. "Sam would have complained that you used too much bronze." Gentle laughter echoed through the gallery. Reynolds smiled. "Probably." Daniel nodded toward the plaque. "Then let's honor him by making sure the detectives standing here ask better questions than we did." Years later, after Captain Daniel Mercer passed away peacefully at the age of 90, every newly assigned homicide detective visited that display before receiving their first major case, before learning advanced forensic techniques, digital evidence analysis, or laboratory procedures. They first learned the story of one elderly detective who arrived at a crime scene as nothing more than an overlooked witness, quietly studied the world around him, and uncovered the truth without touching a single piece of evidence. Beside the display, one final bronze inscription welcomed every future investigator. Evidence rarely hides the truth. More often, people hide it in plain sight. The detective's job is simply to notice what everyone else walks past. Most visitors believed they were looking at an old notebook preserved for history. Those who knew the full story understood they were looking at something far more valuable, a lifetime of experience, a promise kept across 3 decades, and the timeless reminder that the greatest detectives are remembered not because they solved the most cases, but because they taught others how to see what had always been there. Every crime scene tells a story. The question is not whether the truth is there. The question is whether someone is patient enough to recognize it. Captain Daniel Mercer understood that after nearly 4 decades investigating humanity at its best and its worst, he learned that evidence is important, science is indispensable, and forensic technology saves countless investigations. But before any laboratory report is printed, before any fingerprint is identified, and before any DNA profile is matched, a crime scene has already begun speaking. It speaks through patterns, through choices, through things that seem ordinary, until someone asks why they are there. Lieutenant Samuel Walker left behind a lesson that reaches far beyond police work. He believed that the greatest danger facing an investigator was never the lack of evidence, it was the temptation to stop asking questions too soon. Once we become convinced we already know the answer, our eyes often stop searching for the truth. That lesson applies not only to detectives, But to parents, teachers, leaders, doctors, engineers, and every person responsible for making difficult decisions, the most costly mistakes are often made not because people lack intelligence, but because they stop observing before they truly understand. The young detectives in this story were hardworking, dedicated, and well-trained. They followed procedures correctly, protected the crime scene, collected evidence carefully, and waited for scientific analysis. None of those actions were wrong. Daniel simply reminded them that observation is the foundation upon which every successful investigation is built. Science can confirm what happened, but someone must first recognize which questions deserve to be answered. A fingerprint may identify a person, but it cannot explain human behavior. A DNA result can place someone at a location, but it cannot reveal intention. That responsibility still belongs to thoughtful investigators, willing to slow down and see the entire picture. Daniel often said that criminals usually spend enormous effort hiding the truth, yet in doing so they unintentionally reveal themselves. The more carefully someone stages a lie, the more likely they are to leave behind small details that do not belong. Real life is rarely perfect. Staged scenes often are. Learning to recognize that difference requires more than technical skill. It requires patience, humility, and the willingness to look one more time when everyone else believes the work is already finished. Perhaps the most unforgettable moment in this story was not when Captain Daniel Mercer solved the case before the forensic laboratory completed its analysis, nor when the chief of police saluted him before the entire department. It was the quiet moment when Daniel opened Lieutenant Walker's letter after 30 years and reminded a new generation that the purpose of every investigation is never simply to close another case. It is to uncover the truth with honesty, protect innocent lives, and ensure that justice is built upon understanding rather than assumption. That is the kind of legacy every profession should strive to leave behind. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Have you ever known a police officer, detective, teacher, veteran, mentor, parent, or friend whose quiet wisdom helped others see something everyone else had overlooked? We'd be honored to hear your story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories about veterans, law enforcement, leadership, honor, justice, wisdom, perseverance, friendship, sacrifice, and the extraordinary people whose greatest achievements were not the headlines they made, but the lives they quietly changed. May God bless you and your loved ones. Watch over every police officer standing watch through the night. Protect every investigator seeking justice for victims and their families. Strengthen every leader entrusted with difficult decisions. Comfort every family waiting for answers, and remind all of us that truth does not become more valuable because it is discovered quickly. It becomes valuable because someone cared enough to search for it honestly. And may you never forget that sometimes the smallest detail, noticed by the quietest person at the scene, becomes the reason justice is finally served.